I was standing in my small kitchen in Asheville, North Carolina, cradling a steaming cup of coffee when my phone buzzed on the table. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was another client emailing me about a last-minute logo revision. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the sender's name. Mom. My stomach twisted before I even opened the message. Isabella, your father and I would love for you, Jake, and Ethan to come home to Raleigh for Christmas this year. It's been so long, sweetheart. I nearly dropped my coffee. 8 years, 8 long years without a single call, a single text, a single how have you been, and now they suddenly wanted to play happy family. I stared at the message, my breath coming a little too fast. The kitchen, normally my favorite place in the house, the warm, familiar scent of Jake's toast, still lingering in the air, suddenly felt smaller. My hands tightened around my mug as I read the words again, my mind already running in circles. What do they want? Why now? Why after all this time? I glanced out the window at the misty Blue Ridge Mountains, standing quiet and steady in the morning light. I envied them, unshaken, unbothered, nothing like the storm currently raging inside me. I typed out a vague response, I'll think about it. Might be busy. It was a lie. I wasn't busy. Not with anything I couldn't reschedule. But something inside me refused to say yes. Jake, my husband, must have noticed my expression because he set down his coffee and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You okay? I hesitated, still staring at my phone like it might bite me. Then, sighing, I held it up. It's my mom. His brows lifted slightly. Oh, that was all he said. He didn't have to say more. Jake knew everything. I handed him the phone, and he skimmed the message, his jaw tightening slightly. Then, after a long pause, he simply said, If you want to go, I'll stay with Ethan. No way am I letting them drag him into whatever play they're staging this time. That's the thing about Jake. He doesn't tell me what to do. He doesn't push. He just supports me fully, completely, unconditionally. And right now, that was exactly what I needed. I nodded, but my mind was a tangled mess. Should I go? Should I ignore them? Should I call and demand to know what this was about? My best friend, Sarah, always joked that I should post my family drama online, let strangers vote on my next move. Trust me, people on the internet are savage. They'll tell you exactly what you need to hear. I always laughed at the idea. I wasn't about to ask random strangers for advice. And yet, later that night, after Ethan was tucked into bed and Jake had dozed off in front of the TV, I did something I never thought I'd do. I opened my laptop, stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment, then started typing. I need advice. My parents just reached out for the first time in 8 years, inviting me home for Christmas. Should I go, or is this just another trap? I hit post, shut my laptop, and sat back, my heart pounding. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. I wasn't always the outsider in my family. There was a time when I thought I belonged, when I believed that if I just tried hard enough, I'd earn the same love and attention my siblings received so effortlessly. But I was wrong. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment I realized just how disposable I was to them. It wasn't when they forgot to show up to my art exhibitions. It wasn't even when they dismissed my dreams as a silly hobby while celebrating James's basketball trophies and Olivia's volleyball wins. No, it was the day my twin sister stole my boyfriend. His name was Ryan Miller. He had this stupidly perfect smile, the kind that made me forget how to breathe. When we started dating, I was only 15, but I thought it was the start of something real. The first time I brought him home, I was nervous. I sat across from him at the dinner table, my fingers curling around the hem of my sweater as I stole glances at my parents, waiting for some kind of approval. Mum was friendly. Dad laughed at his jokes. Olivia nudged me and smirked. Not bad, Em, she teased. You actually landed a decent one. For the first time in forever, I felt like I had done something right. For 2 years, I let myself believe in the fairy tale. I ignored the way Olivia always lingered a little too long when Ryan was around, how she laughed at all his jokes, how her hand brushed his, just a little too often. I ignored it, until I couldn't. It was a rainy afternoon when my friend Chloe pulled me aside at school. Her expression was hesitant, careful like she was holding a bomb that might explode if she wasn't careful. Izzy, she whispered, glancing around. I need to tell you something. I frowned. What is it? She swallowed. I saw Ryan at the park last night. I blinked. Okay. She hesitated. He was with Olivia. The world tilted slightly. I laughed, a short, forced laugh, shaking my head. You're mistaken. I'm not, Chloe said firmly. They weren't just hanging out, Izzy. They kissed. I stopped breathing. For a long moment, I just stood there, heart hammering, fingers ice cold. And then, without a word, I turned and walked away. I confronted Ryan after school. The rain was pouring by then, drenching my hoodie, sticking my hair to my face. I didn't care. Tell me the truth, I demanded, voice shaking. Are you cheating on me? Ryan's expression shifted, guilt flashing across his face before he dropped his gaze to the pavement. And in that moment, I already knew. Still, I needed to hear him say it. It's true, he admitted. I felt something inside me fracture. With Olivia? My voice was barely a whisper. Ryan winced. Then, with the kind of sincerity that only made it worse, he murmured, I loved you at first, Izzy. But with Olivia, it's just stronger. The words sliced through me like a blade. I wasn't heartbroken because of Ryan. No. The real pain came from Olivia, the one person who was supposed to be part of me. My twin, my best friend. And she had betrayed me without a second thought. I don't remember walking home. I barely remember the sound of my soaked shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor as I stepped into the living room, heart pounding, anger blazing inside me like a wildfire. But I remember Olivia lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. Something inside me snapped. What the hell did you do with Ryan? My voice cracked, raw and furious. Olivia looked up, completely unfazed. Then she smirked. You're overreacting, Izzy. Feelings aren't something you can control. You know that. The red haze that filled my vision was instant. Before I even realized what I was doing, my hand whipped across her face, a sharp, resounding slap that sent her reeling back into the couch, clutching her cheek. For a single frozen moment, she looked stunned. Then chaos. James came thundering down the stairs. Rachel stood in the doorway, staring at me like I was a stranger. My parents stormed in from the kitchen, their voices overlapping, furious. Isabella, have you lost your mind? James grabbed my arm, yanking me back as Olivia pressed an ice pack to her cheek, looking like the victim in all of this. The room erupted into shouting, accusations flying. My own voice felt distant, drowned out by the crash of a lamp hitting the floor, the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. I had struck the match, and now the whole house was on fire. A few hours later, after the shouting had settled, my parents summoned me to the dining room. I sat across from them, my hands clenched into fists under the table, still trembling with anger. Dad sat at the head of the table, his expression stone cold. You could be charged as an adult for assaulting your sister, he said. But we're not involving the police. I exhaled sharply. Good. Then he continued instead. You're going to Charlotte to live with your Aunt Susan. I felt my stomach drop. What? Mum sighed, her lips pressed into a thin line. We can't let this mess tarnish our family's reputation. And that's when I understood. They didn't care that Olivia had betrayed me. They didn't care that Ryan had cheated on me. To them, I was the problem. I was the outcast, the flaw in their perfect picture. I wanted to scream, to cry, to fight back, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. 2 days later, I was shoved into the back of Dad's truck with nothing but a single suitcase. No heartfelt goodbyes, no second chances, just silence. As we pulled away from the house, I turned my head, staring at the front porch one last time. Olivia was standing there, pressing the ice pack to her cheek. She didn't even look at me, like I was already gone. The drive to Charlotte was long, silent, and suffocating. Dad didn't speak, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled tension. I sat in the back, staring blankly at the raindrops trickling down the window, feeling as if I had been erased from my own family like a stain they had finally scrubbed clean. I wasn't crying. I was too angry to cry, too betrayed, too tired. When we pulled up in front of Aunt Susan's apartment, Dad didn't even get out of the truck. He simply popped the trunk, muttered, "Behave yourself," and drove away before I had even reached the front door. That was it. That was my grand farewell from the family I had spent my entire life trying to please. I stood there, suitcase in hand, watching the taillights disappear around the corner, and felt something inside me break. Aunt Susan was waiting for me at the door. She was 48, with silver-streaked brown hair and kind eyes that saw too much. I barely knew her, just the distant whispers of her name in family gossip, the aunt my parents never talked about. I learned why that night. Over takeout pizza, she told me the truth. "Your mum and I haven't spoken in years," she said, swirling her drink in slow, thoughtful circles. I was the first Carter they cut off. I frowned. "Why?" Susan gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Because I came out as gay after college. Our parents disowned me. And when your mom had a chance to do things differently, she didn't." I stared at her, my food suddenly tasteless. "So they just pretended you didn't exist?" Susan shrugged, leaning back against the couch. "Our family sure loves disowning people, huh?" I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Guess I'm officially part of the club. For the first time since being dumped in Charlotte, I didn't feel alone. Starting over at a new school was brutal. Nobody knew me. Nobody knew what I had left behind. I was just another transfer kid. Another stranger navigating the maze of high school cliques. At first, I thought I could disappear, vanish, become a ghost, but Aunt Susan wouldn't let that happen. She pushed me to keep painting, signed me up for art classes, and refused to let me sink into self-pity. "You don't need them to prove your worth," she told me one night, running her fingers through my hair as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. At first, I didn't believe her. But over time, slowly, stubbornly, painfully, I realized she was right. I used to cry because my family had abandoned me. But then I decided they weren't worth another tear. By the time I turned 18, I had clawed my way up from the ashes they had left me in. I got into the University of North Carolina at Asheville, studying graphic design. I threw myself into my art, determined to build a life that was completely my own. And then, in my sophomore year, I met Jake. It was at a student art exhibit, of all places. I was standing in front of one of my watercolor paintings, a misty mountain landscape, when I heard a voice behind me. "Whoever painted this must be pretty deep." I turned, half annoyed at the cheesy pickup line, only to see a grinning, soft-eyed guy with messy brown hair and the warmest hazel eyes I'd ever seen. I raised an eyebrow. "Or just really into mountains?" He laughed. "Fair point. I'm Jake, by the way." That was it. That was how it started. We dated. We fell in love. And 3 years ago, we got married in a small ceremony in a park near our home. I thought about inviting my family, but then I told myself no. They don't deserve to be there. They never did. A year later, we had Ethan. A squirming, giggling, chaotic little miracle. We scraped together enough money to buy our tiny white house in Asheville, turning it into a home filled with laughter, late-night cuddles, and walls decorated with my paintings. For the first time in forever, I felt like I belonged. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, brick by stubborn brick. I had buried the past, and I told myself I would never let them back in. Then, last week, that message from Mom came crashing into my inbox. And suddenly, the past wasn't buried anymore. It was knocking at my door. I should have felt relief when I sent that message. "Thanks for the invite, but I'll be staying in Asheville with Jake and Ethan." It was polite, neutral, final. I expected my mother to push back, maybe guilt-trip me, maybe demand I reconsider. Instead, the reply came quickly. "We respect your decision. Hope we can see you after the holidays." Too easy, too scripted. I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. That wasn't normal. My mother was never the type to accept rejection so easily. I closed the message, tossed my phone on the couch, and tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. But I couldn't. That calm, polite response nagged at me, like a splinter I couldn't ignore. Because if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was this: my family never reached out unless they wanted something. That night, after Jake had fallen asleep, I sat in the dim glow of my laptop, scrolling through my siblings' social media. I hadn't checked in years. I had told myself I didn't care. But suddenly, I needed to know. James, now an investment banker in Raleigh, his profile was a glossy highlight reel, a tailored suit, a mansion-like house, two perfect sons, Rachel, a nurse, divorced, raising her daughter on her own. Her posts were filled with smiling photos, but there was something tired in her eyes. Then, my breath caught as I clicked on Olivia's profile. There she was, my twin, married to Ryan. They had gotten engaged right after high school, no surprise there. They had 2 kids, a house in the suburbs, the picture perfect life. I stared at the screen, feeling nothing. I had long since burned away every ounce of grief, every trace of betrayal. Olivia wasn't my sister anymore. She was just another stranger with my face. So, why now? Why, after 8 years of silence, were they suddenly reaching out? It wasn't money, they were all doing fine. It wasn't some heartfelt reunion, that much was obvious. So what the hell was it? The next morning, I called Aunt Susan. She picked up on the second ring, her voice raspy. "Hey kid, what's going on?" I hesitated, then told her everything. The invitation, the weirdly polite response, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. She didn't sound surprised. They never change, do they? Her voice was sharp, but underneath it, there was something else. Something careful. "What?" I asked. "You know something." There was a pause. Then, Susan let out a slow sigh. "It's your grandfather, Henry Carter." My chest tightened. I hadn't thought about Grandpa Henry in years. A stubborn, proud old man who had always favored my father, who never defended me when my parents cut me off. "What about him?" I asked. Susan hesitated. "He's been asking about you." My grip on the phone tightened. "Why?" "Because he just found out you exist." The words landed like a slap. I felt cold. "What the hell does that mean?" Susan sighed. "Your family told him you cheated on Ryan with his best friend, that when Olivia found out, you attacked her in a jealous rage." I sat there, stunned, my whole body rigid. They lied. They rewrote history. They had twisted everything to make me the villain. And Grandpa Henry, a deeply religious man who hated infidelity, had believed them without question. I shot up from my chair, pacing the kitchen, my pulse pounding in my ears. Why is he asking about me now? Susan's voice was flat. "Because he's rewriting his will." I froze. "What?" "Yeah," she said. "He's a millionaire, is he? And apparently, he told them he won't leave them a damn cent unless they bring you home for Christmas and apologize." A bitter laugh escaped me. Of course. Of course it was about money. They didn't want me back because they missed me. They didn't care that I had built a life without them. They just wanted to secure their inheritance. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. "Unbelievable," I muttered. Susan sighed. "I figured you should know." "Yeah," I said. "Thanks." I hung up, still gripping my phone so tight my fingers ached. And then, slowly, I smiled. Not a happy smile. Not a relieved smile. No, it was cold. Because if they thought they could just waltz back into my life after 8 years, if they thought I was still the scared little girl they threw away, they were about to learn exactly who the hell I had become. I stared out the window, watching the snow drift over the Asheville mountains, my hands clenched into fists. I should have felt relief. I should have laughed at the ridiculousness of it all, the family that abandoned me now scrambling to drag me back just to secure their inheritance. But I didn't feel relief. I felt rage. Not just because of the lies they told. Not just because they had rewritten history to paint me as some jealous, cheating villain. But because, after all these years, they still thought I was stupid enough to fall for it. I picked up my phone, my fingers trembling with anger, and blocked every number. Mom, Dad, James. All of them. Then, just for good measure, I went to Facebook and deleted every friend request I had ignored over the last few days. They didn't deserve access to my life. They didn't deserve to know anything about me. I took a deep breath, staring at the screen, my heart pounding. This was it. I was cutting the last string, and it felt good. Jake found me sitting on the couch later that night, still holding my phone in my lap, staring at the screen like it might catch fire. He sat down beside me, his brows knitting together. You okay? I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. I just blocked my entire family. He didn't look surprised. He just reached over and squeezed my hand. Good. I turned to him, swallowing hard. That's it then. They're out of my life for good. Jake nodded, but there was something else in his eyes. Something careful. Are you sure that's what you want? I hesitated, not because I had doubts, but because, deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not yet. 2 days after Christmas, I was in the living room, stringing gold tinsel around the scraggly little pine tree. We had hauled home from the lot down the road. Ethan was napping upstairs. Jake was humming some off-key Christmas carol in the kitchen, his latest attempt at gingerbread filling the house with a warm, cinnamon-sweet scent. It should have been peaceful, but then pain. A sharp, twisting agony tore through my stomach, so fierce I dropped the ornament in my hands and doubled over, gasping. Jake was at my side in seconds, his face pale. What's wrong? I couldn't breathe, couldn't stand. I gritted my teeth, my voice barely a whisper. Call Laura. Laura, Jake's sister, was a nurse, and she arrived within 10 minutes, her car screeching into the driveway. She and Jake half carried me to the back seat, the icy Asheville wind slicing through my coat as we sped to the hospital. The waiting room was a blur of fluorescent lights and hurried whispers. The pain ebbed and surged, each wave stronger than the last. And then, finally, the doctor walked in. I knew before she even spoke. Her eyes were too soft, too kind. I'm so sorry, Isabella, she said gently. You've had a miscarriage. The words knocked the air from my lungs. I barely felt the hospital bed beneath me. All I felt was loss. Jake sat by my side, his fingers laced through mine, his eyes red-rimmed and glistening. We lost it, he whispered, voice breaking. I nodded. Tears spilled down my cheeks, hot and unstoppable, a flood I couldn't hold back. The physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow emptiness inside me, like a part of my soul had been carved out and left bleeding. Complications kept me in the hospital for 2 more days, flat on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to be strong for Ethan, for Jake. But at night, when the lights dimmed and the world went quiet, I crumbled. We got home just before New Year's. I moved slowly, my body weak, my mind even weaker. Everything felt cold, not just the air outside, but inside me too, like I'd lost something I could never get back. That's why, when my phone rang on the afternoon of January 3rd, I almost didn't pick up. It was an unknown number. I sighed, figuring it was a client chasing a late logo draft, and answered with a clipped, "Hello, this is Isabella." The voice on the other end stopped me cold. "Isabella, it's Grandpa Henry." I froze, my fingers tightening around the phone. Grandpa Henry, a man I hadn't spoken to in almost a decade. A man who had believed my family's lies that I was some jealous, cheating villain who had attacked Olivia out of spite. A man who had never once reached out, not when I was kicked out, not when I graduated, not when I got married or had Ethan. And now, after all this time, he was calling me. I swallowed hard, my voice cold and even. "How did you get this number?" He hesitated. "Your work website. I've been asking about you. Asking about me." I almost laughed. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was anger. Maybe, deep down, I just wanted to hear what excuse he had for abandoning me. So I stayed silent, waiting. His voice was rough, like old paper crumbling at the edges. "I'm sorry, girl, for not reaching out, for believing what they told me. I regret it all. I didn't respond, because regret wasn't enough. Not after what they did to me." He kept talking, his tone almost pleading. "I missed your graduation. Your wedding. The birth of your son. I should have been there. I exhaled sharply, clenching my jaw. Yeah, you should have. A beat of silence. Then his voice softened. I want to make it right. And then, he said the words I had been expecting all along. I'm putting you back in my will, Isabella. There it was. The real reason for this call. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Is that supposed to mean something to me? He hesitated, as if choosing his next words carefully. You deserve it more than they do. I didn't care. I didn't care about his money, didn't care about whatever guilt-fueled attempt at redemption he was offering. But then he said something else, something that made my blood run cold. I've got to say, though, he muttered, his voice taking on a sharper edge. It disappoints me that Ethan doesn't carry the Carter name. Family legacy ought to mean something, you know. My fingers tightened around the phone. Did he seriously just? I took a slow, deep breath, my vision blurring with red. What did you just say? He didn't even hesitate. It's a shame, that's all. The name should have stayed. That was it. 8 years of abandonment. A lifetime of being discarded, ignored, replaced. And now, this old man thought he could waltz in and dictate how I lived my life, judge me for not passing on the family name like it was some sacred, unbreakable tradition. I saw red. You've got some nerve, I spat into the phone, thinking you get to criticize me after everything your Precious's family put me through. I was pacing now, my breath coming fast and sharp. Jake and I chose Bennett for legal reasons, not that it's any of your damn business. And you? You don't get a say. You don't get a vote. You don't get a damn thing. Now, Isabella, I didn't mean. I cut him off, my voice shaking with fury. No, you don't get to backtrack now. You think a check can buy me back? That after you all left me for dead, I'd just come running back for a slice of your fortune? That's hilarious. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Then, quietly, he murmured, I just want to fix things, girl. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You can't fix something that's already dead. And with that, I slammed the phone down on the counter so hard the screen cracked. My breath was ragged, my hands trembling with a mix of fury and something else, freedom. For years, I had felt like a prisoner of my past, like I was still fighting for a place in a family that had never wanted me. But in that moment, I realized something. I didn't need them. I never had. I slid down to the kitchen floor, my back pressed against the cabinets, my pulse thundering in my ears. The past 8 years had been hard, but I had built something real. I had Jake. I had Ethan. And no matter what, I was going to protect the life I had built. If Grandpa Henry followed through and put me in his will, I'd donate every cent to charity. Let it do some actual good instead of lining the pockets of that greedy family. But knowing him, it was probably just hot air. Another empty Carter promise. Not that it mattered, because no amount of money, no apology, no last-minute change of heart could ever undo what they had done to me. But I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. People like them, they don't slink away quietly. They'd dig, they'd pry, maybe even hire some shady pie to track me down. I could picture it now. Mom wringing her hands at some charity brunch, plotting her next move. James flexing his banker connections, trying to find my address. Rachel scheming over cocktails, calculating her next play. Olivia, batting her lashes, pretending to be the victim. I clenched my jaw. Let them try. Let them come. Because the girl they abandoned 8 years ago, she doesn't exist anymore. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. I had expected regret. I had expected that deep, familiar ache, the one that always came after a fight with my family, that made me feel like I had somehow done something wrong. But all I felt was relief. For the first time in my life, I had stood my ground. For the first time, I hadn't let them guilt me, manipulate me, control me. I was done. I was free. But I wasn't stupid enough to think they'd let it go. My family didn't accept defeat. If they thought there was even the slightest chance of getting what they wanted, they would keep pushing. So Jake and I took precautions. We locked down our social media, flipping everything to private, scrubbing old posts, deleting pictures that showed where we lived or where Ethan went to daycare. Jake's parents followed suit. They sent a simple text, "We're not dealing with that circus either." And I couldn't help but smile. Later that evening, I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, watching Ethan stack his wooden blocks into a wobbly tower. His tiny tongue poked out in concentration, his little hands careful and steady, and out of nowhere, tears burned my eyes. Losing the baby, it hadn't just been a punch to the gut. It had been a freight train I hadn't seen coming. I had spent quiet moments imagining her. Yeah, I decided she was a girl. With Jake's hazel eyes and maybe my stubborn streak a little shadow, chasing Ethan around the yard. Now she was gone, and the emptiness gnawed at me, a dull ache that flared up when I least expected it. Jake was my rock. He'd shuffle in with a mug of chamomile tea when he saw me zoning out. He'd wrap his arms around me late at night when the tears hit, murmuring, "We'll get through this, Em, I swear." And slowly, painfully, I started to believe him. One evening, after Ethan was tucked into bed, I sat at the kitchen table, doodling aimlessly on a napkin, and told Jake, "I think I want to see someone, a therapist, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to be solid. For him, for Ethan, for myself." Jake squeezed my hand and nodded. "Whatever you need, babe." And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. A week later, I sat alone in my little home office. The desk was cluttered with Skechers logos for a local brewery, a poster for a friend's band. The quiet gave me space to think, and as I traced lazy circles on a scrap of paper, it hit me. Family isn't about blood. My so-called family had treated me like garbage. They had shoved me aside, spun lies, and rewrote history to justify their selfishness. But I had risen from that dumpster fire. I had built something real, and I wasn't letting them drag me back down. I chuckled darkly, picturing them now. Mom, clutching her pearls at some charity fundraiser. Dad, polishing his sports car, pretending he wasn't drowning in debt. James and Rachel scheming over cocktails, calculating their next move. Olivia, batting her lashes, playing the victim. All of them clawing at Grandpa's fortune, desperate to secure their piece of the pie. Let them rip each other apart. I was out. One chilly evening, as January stretched into its bleak middle, Jake and I bundled up and stepped onto the back porch. Ethan snuggled between us, wrapped in a puffy jacket that made him look like a marshmallow. Snow fell in soft, lazy flakes, blanketing the mountains in the distance. He asked, his breath fogging in the cold. I looked at him, at his messy hair dusted with snow, at his eyes, soft but sure, and I felt something glow inside me, thawing the edges of my battered heart. "Yeah," I said, squeezing his hand. "We're going to be just fine." The past was still out there, lurking like a shadow. I couldn't quite shake, but I wasn't running from it anymore. I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't waiting for the next attack, the next betrayal, the next manipulation. I had finally closed the door, and no matter how hard they knocked, no matter how desperately they clawed at the edges of my life, trying to drag me back, I wasn't opening it again, not for them, not ever. For weeks, I half expected more fallout, more texts, more emails, more desperate attempts to worm their way back in. But there was silence. A part of me wondered if they had finally given up. But deep down, I knew better. They were plotting, scheming, waiting for their next move. And sure enough, it came. It was a thin, white envelope, tucked neatly into my mailbox one morning. No return address. But I knew exactly who it was from before I even opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, neatly typed, polite, official. It was a formal request for a family meeting, a last-ditch effort to pull me back into their web, and at the bottom, in a stiff, practiced script, my father's signature. I stared at it for a long moment. Then, without a second thought, I crumpled it into a ball and tossed it into the fireplace. And I didn't look back. That was the moment I truly felt free. not just because I had cut them off, not just because I had blocked their numbers or ignored their messages, but because I had stopped caring, stopped waiting for an apology that would never come, stopped mourning the idea of a family I never really had. For the first time in my entire life, I wasn't carrying their weight anymore, and I never would again. 3 months later, on a cool spring evening, I found myself sitting on our back porch again. The air smelled like fresh rain and pine, the mountains in the distance bathed in soft golden light. Ethan sat on the porch steps, humming to himself as he lined up his toy cars, his tiny fingers carefully arranging them just right. Jake leaned against the railing beside me, sipping his beer, watching the sky fade into shades of deep purple. This was my family, not the people I had left behind, not the people who had spent years breaking me down, but the ones who had helped me build myself back up. Jake, Ethan, Aunt Susan, and Uncle David, Jake's parents, the people who had earned their place in my life, the people who had never asked me to be anything other than myself. I turned to Jake and smiled. "We should take a trip." He raised an eyebrow. "A trip?" I nodded. "Italy. We always talked about going, but we kept putting it off." A slow grin spread across his face. "You're serious?" I shrugged. "Why not? For once, I want to spend my money on something that makes me happy. For once, I wanted to live for me." Jake laughed, shaking his head. "All right, Italy it is." Ethan clapped his hands, even though he had no idea what we were talking about, just happy to be part of the excitement. And as I sat there, watching the last light of the sun disappear beyond the mountains, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I had spent so long waiting for closure, for justice, for some kind of reckoning that would finally balance the scales. But the truth was, I didn't need closure. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need them to admit they were wrong or to suddenly see my worth, because in the end, they didn't matter anymore. I had chosen myself. I had chosen my happiness. And that was enough. I turned my head slightly, as if speaking to the imaginary audience I had spilled my guts to online. A small, knowing smile tugged at my lips. "Thanks for sticking with me through this saga, folks. It's been a hell of a ride." I let out a real laugh this time, a light, freeing kind of laugh. And then, without another word, I followed Jake and Ethan inside, closing the porch door softly behind me, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, behind me,